We're pretty lucky to have Marissa Hall, who's a candidate as a fellow here. I'm Barry Coffin, been a fellow a long time here. And Marissa's got her undergrad degree at UNC in International Studies, and she became bilingual in Spanish. Then she had 4 years off where she worked in Guatemala 1 year with an NGO dealing with domestic abuse and classes with those women and working with them one-on-one. She then later on worked with Honduras. So she's she's lived in Ecuador, Honduras, and Guatemala at different points and has worked really focused on Latino issues. I've been lucky to mentor her on the K Award she got, but she's much more than that. She's had 38 publications already in her young career. She's a faculty member in health behavior, health education. She was a CPC pre-doc at one point. So she's got lots of other things going. And now her work is slowly moving more and more to policy, which is dear to my heart, and in the food area. So Marissa's going to present her background now. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave early too, because I have to go on fly off.
Thanks for that introduction. Thank you all for being here today. So yes, I'm going to talk about how I use behavioral science and experimental methods to inform public policy and using health warning labels as an example. So I'd like to just acknowledge funding for this work and the many collaborators on this work with people from both the kind of tobacco warning label side and the more recent food and sugary beverage warning label work that I've been doing. So just to get started with, and can everyone hear me? Okay. It's a nice small room. So yeah, to talk a little bit about why we care about health warning labels and the promise of them. Smoking and unhealthy diets are two really major causes of preventable death and disease worldwide and in the US. And there's some key disparities to keep in mind when thinking about policies to address these issues. So with smoking, some of the major disparities really relate to low income and gay, lesbian, and bisexual populations being at higher risk of starting smoking. And with obesity, there's key racial ethnic disparities with Latino and Black populations. So product health warnings. This is an example of the largest graphic health warning.
And people can ask questions during the talk. I forgot the concept.
Yeah, I forgot to mention. So these are the largest graphic health warnings in the world from Australia. And as you can see, they're very eye-catching, literally. And one really nice thing about warnings is that they have really high reach and high exposure, and they're paired with the behavior you're trying to deter. So it's a great option. Of course, there's a few remaining questions about how these work. So a couple things I'll touch on today is what's the impact on disparities? So one potential downside of warnings is that you can't tailor them or target them. They're really intended to be universally applied. So you just want to make sure that they're reaching the people who most need the information or would benefit from the effects. So I'll touch on that a little bit. And then there's also a very large body of research on tobacco product warnings, but the area of sugary beverage and food warnings is newer. So this is happening in the policy realm, but there's not as much behavioral science to inform how to really design these with the greatest impact as possible. So it's unclear the extent to which we know what works for tobacco applies in this newer context. And then I'll also be kind of arguing for the benefit of experimental work to couple with some of the longitudinal observational data collection that we need to do as well. So, observational studies are great for evaluating the impact of policies in the real world, and there's many advantages, but there's certain questions that experiments are really geared to answer. So that's really where my research lies. So experiments are really useful for many reasons. For one, they can help us to design warnings that are maximally effective. So warnings have all kinds of different varieties. There's different colors, shapes, sizes, pictures or not, different topics, and even just the type of causal language that you use in a warning makes a difference. So experiments can help us tease out all of those things as we're designing them. And of course, by using randomization, you can make causal inferences about the effects on behavior, which is really important for being able to support their uses of policy. And of course, you can understand how warnings change behavior. This is an area I'm really interested in as a behavioral scientist. So what are the mechanisms or mediators of change? Of course, you can look at the effects on different population subgroups with any kind of study, but with experiments, you can look at moderation and know to what extent warnings might be working with different groups. And then supporting regulatory agencies, informing litigation. I think having evidence from multiple kinds of studies is really important. And we've seen in the US context, having experimental research on warning labels on US populations, it comes up a lot in litigation around warning labels. And finally, you don't have to just stop at the experiment. Experiments lend themselves really nicely to being synthesized across a larger body of research using meta-analyses and also extrapolating with long-term health effects with simulation modeling. So that's my little plug for why I love experiments to kind of couch the research I'll be showing today. And I'll start with a quick background on cigarette warnings in the US and some of the research I've done in this area. And then I'll talk about two more recent studies that are all focused on Latino parents with the goal of reducing sugary drink purchasing for children in this group. And so the first study is an online experiment of sugary drink warnings, and the second is looking at sugar drink policies in an actual physical store laboratory. And then I'll close with some future directions. Okay, cigarette warnings. Well, this is a really graphic. Cigarette pack warnings are extremely prevalent worldwide. Canada was the first country in 2001 to implement graphic cigarette pack warnings, and since then, 118 countries have followed suit. This is well over half of the world's population. The US, as I'm sure you know, is well behind. It's interesting though, the US was actually the pioneer in requiring text warnings for the first time in the 60s, but we have not changed our warnings in over 30 years, and they're completely stale and unnoticed. So in 2009, this is just a little history of where we are in the US with warnings. Congress gave FDA regulatory authority over tobacco via the Tobacco Control Act, and here's Obama signing this into law. And then basically FDA was required to come up with graphic warning labels to put on cigarette packs. So they came up with 9 specific warnings using a regulatory process and research, and those warnings were sued or challenged by the tobacco industry in 2 high-profile cases, the second of which ended in a bad decision for FDA. So the DC Circuit Court of Appeals held that the rule violated the First Amendment, and this was one of the examples of the warnings that FDA proposed. So this is just something to kind of pause on and just know about the future of warning labels in the US. It's really an uphill battle because the First Amendment has been applied really broadly to protecting corporations, more and more so over the last decade or two. And so anytime you require a warning label on a product or an advertisement, that's a type of compelled commercial speech. And there's specific restrictions on that need to be met in order for this to be deemed constitutional. So essentially in this court case, the warnings were deemed to be unconstitutional because they were not factual and they were controversial, and they were apparently, the courts, not to say agree with this ruling, but the warnings were being criticized for not advancing a government interest of public health. And part of the real sticking point was the lack of experimental causal inference kind of research in US populations, because FDA had pointed to all the global examples and some online studies, but I think this is an area where public health can really make a difference and researchers can inform the future of these warnings. So basically the US decided the government decided not to appeal this decision, and so FDA has been conducting new rulemaking, new research to come up with new warnings. And just in August of 2019, just a couple months ago, they introduced a new proposed ruling. Finally, they actually got sued by the public health industry. I was just at a conference talking to a bunch of tobacco industry people, which I didn't really know when I signed up for it. But the main thing the public health community and the industry had in common was being frustrated with FDA for various reasons. But FDA was basically mandated by law to follow this timeline now. So anyway, in March 2020, they'll have to issue a final ruling. And at that point, they will likely be challenged again, we're guessing, by the industry. So this is all to say that anyone working in the warning label space in the US should really kind of get to know this case law and also follow what's going on with the tobacco side of things, because the precedent based on how these court cases go will then apply to different product warning label cases moving forward. So at the time of this court case in 2012, there was no behavioral evidence of the causal impact of the warnings in the trial. So this seemed like a really key area to address with our research. And when I was in the doctoral program, I worked closely with Noel Brewer and his group to do a trial with over 2,000 smokers, and it was a 4-week study. where we randomly assign people to get a graphic warning or a text warning on their actual cigarette pack and followed them over 4 weeks and saw what happened, and found that the pictorial warnings did increase quit attempts during the trial, and then also increased the percentage who successfully quit smoking by the end of the study. So we couldn't follow them up longer due to budget constraints, but this was really promising, a promising sign that they're actually having behavioral effects. And this is an area where the observational research really lines up nicely with the experimental side of things. So Seth Knorr and colleagues conducted a systematic review of pre-post changes in other countries that have strengthened graphic warnings, seeing similar kinds of declines in smoking prevalence. So there's more and more evidence showing that graphic warnings can really help make a public health impact. In terms of the disparities piece and the reaching different populations, we recruited about half low-income smokers, given the high rates of disparities there, and high numbers of gay, lesbian, and bisexual smokers, and found that the warnings worked equally well across all the characteristics that we assessed, which was great. I mean, of course, in an ideal world, they would work even better for these groups, but we felt it was a really good sign that they were at least working equally well. So it wasn't just that the warnings were communicating to people who were higher income or already at lower risk of smoking. And then some of my independent work as a doctoral student in my dissertation really dealt with whether or not graphic warnings have unintended consequences. So this is something that people bring up a lot and is kind of an argument in the public arena. So I looked at Reactance. This guy exemplifies Reactance to me. He's wearing a DARE t-shirt while they're both doing drugs and holding a gun, which is impressive coordination. But the idea is that you don't like being told what to do. So you're going to actually do the opposite or want to do something harmful to, kind of contradict the message that's being thrown at you. So I, in my dissertation, developed a reactance scale and then found that people did have higher reactance to graphic versus text warnings, but it wasn't enough to undermine the overall benefits. So basically, these strong warnings that are likely to have an impact on behavior, there's likely some amount of this reactance that's happening, but I think there's a certain amount of reactance that we can tolerate at the overall benefit of promoting public health. So I think a warning that's going to be effective, I don't know that there's a way to do that without having some reactance, basically. So then the other unintended consequence that I've been interested in and have been studying a little bit is avoidance. So we see anecdotally that smokers in countries with graphic warnings do all kinds of things to cover up the warning. They put stickers on the warning. There's a market for cases with all kinds of cartoon care, all kinds of stuff where people will put their cigarettes in cases to avoid looking at the warning. So this is often used as kind of a critique of warnings that if you implement them, people will just find a way to ignore them or not pay attention to them, so why bother? But at least in our couple of trials that I looked at, smokers did avoid warnings and more so stronger warnings, but that avoidance was actually a marker for more quitting, which is really intriguing. And it seems to be some kind of a predictor of the warnings having a beneficial effect. So I looked also at mediation of what was driving the avoidance, and it was really kind of this negative affective response instead of reactance. So it's people are avoiding them because they're really powerful and gripping, and that actually indicates that they're working, which is kind of just an interesting counterpoint to people who dismiss warnings as not, doing anything because you can just avoid them. I'm interested to know how avoidance kind of works in other contexts. That's not, you really can't ever get away from your cigarette pack if you're a smoker, but I'm interested to look at avoidance of things like campaigns and other kinds of interventions to see how that shakes out. So that's a very brief synopsis of my tobacco control space. And then, as Barry mentioned, more recently I've been starting to work more on the area of sugary drink warnings. So I'm still a co-investigator on some tobacco work, but then more and more I'm really intrigued about, given that sugary drink warnings is a newer policy and just kind of getting steam, how can these kinds of lessons in behavioral science apply? So I'll now switch to talking about some more recent research in this area. And this first study is funded by a Robert Johnson Foundation grant, and we're developing and evaluating pictorial health warnings for sugary drinks. So I just want to highlight these disparities in sugary drink intake. So this shows the percent of children and adults consuming sugary drinks on a given day. And both in children and adults, there's higher rates among Black and Latino populations compared to white. And we care about sugary drink intake for lots of reasons, but it's been described as the single largest driver of the obesity epidemic. And there's, unlike other foods that contain sugar, there's not often nutritional benefits or other good nutritional components to sugar-sweetened beverages. And then, of course, what my nutrition colleagues have taught me is that sugary drink intake, it doesn't really satiate you. So you tend to just keep, you don't really, it doesn't replace calories that you would otherwise consume. So it's basically an easy target if you want to reduce the amount of added sugar and calories that people are consuming. Okay, so sugary drink warnings in the US. The only law that has passed so far is the San Francisco Ordinance, and this is what it looks like. So this is State of California Safety Warning. Drinking beverages with added sugars may contribute to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and tooth decay. So this is the version, so the American Beverage Association sued, and there's been litigation already. This is essentially the revised version that San Francisco has put forth. This is not yet, this is intended to go in advertisements. It's still wrapped up in litigation. So we don't know where this will go. But this is at least being talked about at more the state and local level, which is different from tobacco, which is all happening at the federal level. So 5 US states have proposed sugary drink product warnings, and actually California right now has an active law that passed the Senate and is now going to the House. And it was really fun. I just got to present some of this research at a meeting with people who are actively working on the active policies. So it's just a fun area because this is on the table, but these groups really want research to help inform the design of the warnings. So I'm really interested in what's the impact of these warnings on people in the US with lower literacy or who are English speakers. So there's actually 17.5 million Latinos in the US with limited English proficiency, and Latinos are the fastest growing minority population. And every single warning label policy that's been proposed or passed in the US is only in English. There's several, I actually got an interesting insight into why. It's basically just, first of all, the size requirements is one of the biggest sticking points in the court case. So there's just a limited amount of space. And then no one's really been able to figure out a good way of picking if you just do Spanish, what about the other languages? And then how do you swap out the languages? So basically that's why California added this icon in at least an attempt to communicate some kind of warning information to people who aren't going to want to read the label for lots of reasons, or people in California have a very high number of non-English speaking populations. So this is kind of a key area that I really want to focus on going forward with my research. Okay, so the objectives of this study, first to examine reactions to different sugary drink warning topics. So as you saw, the California warnings, those are all health warnings. So really similar to the tobacco kind of warnings, this causes or contributes to different health effects. These, I'm sure many of you recognize, are the Chilean warning labels that, they're actually in several countries, but Chile was the first to require this kind of nutrient, I'm calling them nutrient warnings, where it says something like high in sugar, high in sodium. So there's nothing about health in here, but clearly it's an octagon. It's intended to convey some kind of warning information. So I think in the US, this is a really active question. So is the nutrient approach better? Is the health approach better? Which is more constitutionally viable? Which one's more effective? So I really wanted to help contribute to answering that question, and then also explore this question of type. So how much better is an icon warning than text? And what about graphic? Is that a lot better than icon? Is it the same as icon? Those kinds of questions really haven't been studied in this context. And then I was really interested in looking at whether pictorial warnings, so by pictorial I mean icon and graphic, could help improve health equity or communicate information among Latinos in the US with limited English proficiency. So we spent a lot of time, well, it's actually a pretty quick grant, but we spent as much time as we could developing the warnings because, it seems straightforward. Okay, just use the San Francisco warning or use whatever warning, but really we wanted to put a lot of time into this part of the process. So we selected initial warning topics and images based on really a few different factors. We looked at the strength of the evidence about different health effects because a lot of that factual and uncontroversial piece comes back to how defensible is this statement? Is this rock solid? Is there any way you can poke holes? So we really tried to go with statements that were as strong as possible from a factual standpoint. And then I'm really fortunate to work closely with Alison Lazard and the Hussman School of whatever it's called now, journalism, media, I think. They just changed their name, but she's a fantastic experimental researcher who also is a professional designer and is really an expert in visual communication. So she led a lot of this process, and we came up with an initial set of images, and then had a very interesting stakeholder call where basically everyone hated all the images, which happens a lot. But that's the point. You know, we wanted to see what are the concerns with this. I'm just joking. They loved some of them, but they had really good ideas that we then decided, you know, we really need to pause and do some more pre-testing, because what we've learned is you can sit in a room with 5 people, 10 people, and people just have all kinds of opinions, and we really like to crowdsource that and try to get more opinions, because once you look at the averages, then you kind of come to some kind of data-driven decision. So we were feeling a little stuck. So we added some extra pre-testing that we hadn't planned on doing, and I think it was really useful. So this is just an example. We looked at weight gain as one of the outcomes, and this was one of the hardest ones because we have concerns about, you know, of course, we don't want to cause weight stigma. But weight gain is really one of the best pieces of evidence that we have in terms of trials showing SSBs causing weight gain. So we wanted to at least test it. So we tested a few different things. We had kind of a more, you know, put on scale, kind of not as much of a human approach. We know that a lot of times faces and looking at people can be more effective. But we wanted to at least try this kind of approach. And then we had 2 photographs and then these log things, which we didn't expect to work so well. But they actually really performed well in our pre-testing. We asked people to pick the warning that most discouraged them from wanting to consume SSBs. And then we did a second round, because a lot of times we could easily weed out bad, you know, poorly performing images. And then we then did a second round of pre-testing to pick between the top 2. So this was the best one in the first one, and then we confirmed it in the second round of pre-testing. So we did that for all of our topics and just felt more confident going into the online study, having done a little bit of that work. I'll just pause. Any questions at this point?
Do you do any sort of debriefing of the people to find out why they picked certain images?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I forgot to mention it. We often, in this study, we also got open-ended data on the images. So what we did was we asked them to, for the one that they picked, we then said, forget the exact item, but it was like, what did you think about when you saw this image? What did this image make you think about? Because we really want to make sure, first of all, we scanned especially this topic to look for any kind of problematic responses that were kind of stigma related, but also just, are people interpreting this the way we want? So we want to find things like, do people see this and everyone just thinks like of some particular person or something? Like the example we always talk about is like with our picture of a heart one time, people thought it looked like a sweet potato. We were like, that's not really what we were going for. So I think there's, you know, a lot of, we look at both the qualitative and the quantitative. So this is kind of the main driver, and then we just do kind of a spot check to just see what people are thinking. Yeah.
Following on that question, do you have any information about the characteristics of the people who didn't react to any of the warnings, any of the pictures?
Well, that's a good question. We did not force them, like they were allowed to skip the item, but almost everybody answered it. So that's, there were basically, I think there were no missing data on this. And it's partly because we use, for this, we used Amazon Mechanical Turk, where people are like, they tend to just have high rates of completing surveys. But in the later data I'll show, we haven't yet gotten to that piece where we've looked at, you know, potential, I'll show some moderation of findings in the actual study, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm trying to think if the evaluations could be tailored in a way where you certainly identify the people who will react to the
Right.
picture. But also, what about those that will not be convinced by the,
Yes.
for which a different kind of interventions might be needed to change the behavior?
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. And that was what I ended up saying in the reactance work, is that it's problematic. You know, this is not going to work for everyone. So even if it works on average at the population level, there will be people left behind or just not motivated by the topic. And, you know, warning label policies will have to go forward with one warning, or well, in the FDA's case, there actually will be 9, but certain messages aren't going to reach certain people. So I always like to think of warnings as just one part of a larger toolkit of policies and interventions, and it should never be the end all be all. And I that's why I really love tailored campaigns kind of in combination with warning labels. And so I think you have a lot of freedom with campaigns to use different kinds of themes that might reach certain people. So like with Reactance, themes of irony and humor and testimonials, like there's a lot of different ways you can message to people that would elicit lower reactance and might reach those people. So I guess my answer is that warnings need to reach the most number of people possible, but then, you know, coupling them with other things is really key for that reason.
Well, sort of continuing that, I mean, it seems like the warning that might dissuade someone from developing a bad habit is really different from the one that might get someone to think about quitting. And
Right.
you know, you could
That's
think
true.
about putting these different types on in proportion to what you think the distribution of these things are across the population, or that there's a novelty value to seeing a different warning.
Yes. And we
You know, I mean,
definitely,
you can start ignoring the
Yeah.
diseased lung after a certain period
Right.
of time, but
yes, and that's a great point. A lot of countries have built in rotation into their policies for that reason exactly, which is why it's so frustrating that the US hasn't changed their warnings in 30 years, because normally you're supposed to change them every 6 months to a year. And that's what most countries do because of this kind of declines wear out effect that you're going to expect. So I think that's absolutely right. And then I think that population differences is really crucial. And I don't have a lot of bandwidth to lead a lot of tobacco work right now, but I'm really, the graphic warning labels in the US have really not been tested much with youth because it's just harder. There's ethical issues, there's recruitment issues, but it's also just hard to get power to detect initiation because it's a rare event, and there's just all kinds of reasons why, but I think there's lots of ways we can do it, and just with different outcomes. So I think looking at youth prevention based on warnings in tobacco is a really understudied area that I'm excited about. All right, I'll keep moving. Show you some actual, that was just the pre-tested data. We got more. So we conducted this experiment, just finished it in October. So I'm really still, I haven't written the paper yet. I really just finished the data analysis. So would love to hear people's reactions and thoughts about how to frame this moving forward. But this was a sample of over 1,000 parents of children ages 2 to 12. And it was about half Latino or Latina parents, about a quarter with limited English proficiency, and about half high school degree or less. And the design, we did a between within subjects design. So the between subjects factor was warning topics. So here we have added sugar, which is the kind of nutrient type warning, and then 3 health effects, weight gain, I already mentioned, and then we looked at type 2 diabetes and heart damage, and then a control. And then we manipulated within subjects warning type. So we tested text, icon, and graphic. So just one example in the added sugar condition, everyone who is assigned to this saw all 3 of these warnings in a random order. And then here's the rest of the warnings, so you can see what we came up with. And so you've already seen this one, but then we basically picked the image, and then Allison created the icon to match. So the text is the same in all 3 of them, the statement itself. And then the measures, the primary outcome was perceived message effectiveness. And an example is this message discourages me from wanting to drink beverages with added sugar. We really love this outcome. It's, I think, the best possible outcome in an online study of this type because it's really sensitive to changes, kind of small changes or differences between warnings, but it's also in our validation work that's predictive of long-term behavior change. So we tend to use this in these kind of early online studies. And then also assess thinking about the risks. So how much does this message make you think about the health problems caused by drinking beverages with added sugar, perceived product healthfulness, and then intentions to purchase the drink for their child. And I'll mention with the language issue, so we have used these items many times with English-speaking populations, but this was the first time we tested them in Spanish. So we had them professionally translated and then cognitively tested them with 10 native Spanish speakers and edited them accordingly. And then it's interesting, this is kind of typical with cross-cultural measurement issues, but then the cognitive testing then revealed some things we hadn't picked up on with the English. So it kind of, we went through this editing process and then landed on our final items. So for the analysis, I ran mixed effects linear models looking at warning topic and warning type, and then examined interactions with this key variable of English proficiency, and then also looked at educational attainment to try to understand what was going on a little bit more. Okay, so the data. This on the x-axis, the first outcome was perceived message effectiveness, and then these are coefficients from the mixed effects linear models. And then each of these bars is comparing to the control. So basically all of the warnings worked better than the control, and then they were not different from each other, which I haven't depicted with stars, but they're not significantly different. So to me, this is actually really good news from a policy standpoint that there's lots of different options that might be effective, and so you can kind of have more options for rotation or pick ones based on legal viability. I will say there's Anna Grumman, who I'm sure many of you know, who did her dissertation on this topic. She actually found that an added sugar warning was not as effective as the health warning she tested. And so we're trying to kind of understand what are some of the potential explanations for that. And also I'm working with her on a meta-analysis to try to synthesize across and really answer this question with more than just one study, because I think it's a really key question. Then thinking about risks, all the topics also made people think about the risks more, which I should mention is part of an empirically and theoretically driven model that we use. And this is one of the key variables that is predictive of behavior change. Perceived product healthfulness is not in our model because we've actually found in the tobacco literature that this surprisingly doesn't change that perceived risk, and kind of perceived perceptions of healthfulness are harder to change. And well, I'm not sure if that's why, but for some reason, warnings do not always kind of have changes in that particular outcome. So this is something that we wanted to see if it was the case in this context. So the added sugar warning did, and these are all in the right direction. They're just really small side effect sizes. And then intention, similarly, kind of a bit smaller effect sizes, but here we do see that all four of them lowered intentions to purchase sugary drinks for their child. So overall, warnings are working the way we want them to, and the topics themselves don't seem to make a big difference. And then warning type, so the blue bar is icon versus text, and the orange is graphic versus text. So this is the order that we expected, that icon would perform better than text, graphic would as well, and graphic was also significantly better than icon on this outcome. And when you look back at the warnings, it's not that surprising. The graphic warnings are really, really, intended to be very evocative and attention grabbing. So this to me is also good news in that across all these outcomes, the icon was better than text and graphic was better than text in the sample with, again, half Latinos and a quarter of the Latinos non-English or limited English proficiency. And then with moderation, so basically what we expected was that the icon and graphic warnings compared to the text would be better overall, but then that impact would be stronger for Latinos with limited English proficiency. So this was the slope or the coefficient for the high English proficiency group, and the limited English proficiency group that relationship was stronger, and the moderation was statistically significant. So these lines don't look very different, but they are actually different. And I'll mention that the graphic warning, there was no moderation. So basically, the graphic warnings were better than text for everyone, and it wasn't more so the case for those with limited English proficiency. And then you'll see there's a main effect of English proficiency, so the overall means were higher among those with limited English proficiency, which I'm still thinking about and would love to hear thoughts on why that might be the case. But my initial thought might just be kind of novelty of the content. If this group is more likely to be first-generation immigrants, maybe hasn't been exposed to as much health messaging around sugary beverages, but still kind of thinking about this finding. And then no moderation by educational attainment either. So the one thing we found was based on this variable of limited English proficiency. Okay, so basically the nutrient warnings and the health warnings were both likely to discourage, or both had the beneficial effects on predictors of behavior change. And the use of the icons or photographs, I really do think is something we should consider with policies as a way of communicating information, because they outperformed overall. And then among those with limited English proficiency, the icons seem to have an even greater effect, not than the graphic, but compared to those with high English proficiency. Of course, so some strengths that I already talked about, I think obviously randomization, and then this extensive stimuli development process with stakeholder engagement, and also 2 rounds of pre-testing, I think was a strength. in the cognitive testing. But of course, with any study, there's limitations. So this was the convenience sample, which we use a lot because we can afford it. But the nice thing is that we actually, my colleague Michelle Zhang, who is now at Rutgers, let us study comparing experimental findings from 25 different experiments that were replicated in convenience versus nationally representative samples, and 21 of the 25 had identical findings in terms of the size or the direction and significance of the effects. So, I mean, this is really something that people kind of have always said, but it's nice to have an empirical test of these things because a lot of times, you know, experiments, one of the big downsides is that it might not be generalizable, but it's nice to know that a lot of the time, if you replicate it, it will hold up. So of course, this is a next step that I would like to do is doing some of these experiments and probability-based samples. So let me know if you have any that I can add things onto. Because again, it's hard with budget reasons mostly. And then of course, with you know, a certain sample size, there was only so many topics and warning types we can test. So there's other things that I would like to test. So for example, what happens when you combine 3 health outcomes together versus just one? That's a question that really hasn't been explored, and I think we don't know the answer to that yet. And then these are all related, but in an online study, there's limited artificial exposure. You have to rely on self-report, and there's no behavioral outcomes. So this is kind of key thing, which really leads into my second study, which is testing this new food store model to see, can we use an actual store or a store laboratory basically to test these types of policies. So I think we've talked about a lot of this already, so I'll go pretty quickly here. But again, there's disparities in sugary drink intake, obesity, and type 2 diabetes among Latinos, but there's very little research on the impact of policies among Latinos in the US. And again, we need this kind of controlled but realistic setting to be able to get the more objective behavioral outcomes. So that brings me to the UNC Mini Mart, which I'm really excited about. The final product is here on the right. So I'm sure a lot of you know Lindsay Taylor, who's my co-lead on all of this work. And so we were in touch with Alice Averman at HPDP, who had some extra space that she was really supportive, and they've been amazing at helping us kind of figure out how to make this happen and gave us a spot there. I don't know if you know where it is, but it's really nice because it's accessible to participants. It's right off of 2 bus lines, and there's a parking lot, so it's fairly easy to find. So there was absolutely nothing in here, and there weren't walls. So the first thing was we had to build those kind of partition walls. And then we searched all over the triangle, and actually this is from Benson, and went to this year's store closing sale. So this is actually the unit that we bought, this toy shelf. I haggled it down to $100. Very proud of myself. It was $130, so it wasn't like a huge deal. And then took the blue stuff off, took the toys off, took one of the middle partitions out, and then that was that. Then we did buy some stuff that sadly we couldn't use. So we got a really awesome, like large commercial refrigerator that we didn't, Carmen does well, didn't realize worked and did not work until we moved it all the way in and then plugged it in, and we're like, something smells bad in here. So I had to get rid of that, but it's been a really fun and interesting project that we've learned how to build a store and using the shoestring budget with various startup funds. So it is final, it is here, it happened, which is kind of crazy. And we're using it in our first study to conduct a pilot study. So the first objective of the pilot study is really a process evaluation. So what is the experience of participants in a store? Is this kind of study acceptable to people? What are initial reactions? And then validation aims. So we assume that this will mimic real life purchasing behavior. That's the whole point. But empirically, is that the case? Do people buy things in the store? Does that mimic their real world purchasing behavior? So to do this study, we used NHANES data with help from CPC to look at basically how to stock beverages based on the most popular categories in our target population. And then we also had some stakeholder interviews after we did our initial set, just to see what are we missing, what kind of things can they were really smart, and someone suggested having kind of Zach playing in the background to make it seem more realistic. So we did that, which helps. It really, there's something about that music that makes you feel like you're in a grocery store. So little things like that to help improve the realism. And then we priced the products using an average of non-sale prices at local Walmart and Food Lion stores. And then for the sample, we recruited 59 Latino or Latina parents of children ages 2 to 18. And most of them are taking surveys in Spanish, which is really like we get them the option of which language. And so this is really exciting because we didn't know with the research study we would be able to reach enough, kind of people who hadn't necessarily been in studies before for Spanish. And so it's been a really successful pilot so far. So the design is that participants attend 5 weekly store visits, and at the first visit is a control where there's no intervention. And then in weeks 2 to 5, there's intervention, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And we ask them to buy a week's worth of beverages for their family every week, and then the cost of that is deducted from their study incentive. And then they take home, the incentives are about $40 to $70 a visit. And then they take computer surveys at each visit where we assess all kinds of reactions and demographic characteristics and things like that. Okay, so the first cohort, which just finished about a week ago, they saw, this was meant to emulate or mimic a tax increase on sugary drinks. So we increased the prices by a penny per ounce tax, which raised the prices about 30% on average. And that was, Shuan and Lindsay really led this process because they know the tax side of things really well. But this was on the lower end of the actual policy of being a penny per ounce, but because we have 100% pass through in the store, we wanted the actual price increase that consumers saw to be realistic. So this is about what you would expect with a lot of the policies. And then cohort 2, they saw a warning label. So this is after the first visit where we did their baseline visit. They all saw warning labels on sugary drinks on the actual product. So this is a warning that Anna Grumman tested in her dissertation. So we hadn't done our warning development, and this warning changed behavior in her RCT. So we went with that warning. Okay, so the process evaluation methods, we wanted to first see retention. So can we keep people in the study? And our goal is 90%, which is a high goal, but it's with the pilot, we just wanted to see if we could do that. And then looking at acceptability of being in the study, barriers to participation, anything about the realism of the store that we could improve upon for the next study. And we assessed this with closed-ended process measures in the surveys, and then at the final visit, exit interviews. And then also we'll be looking at pre-post changes in purchases. This is not really the main goal because we're not doing an RCT and we don't have power, but we're going to at least exploratory analyses to look at pre-post changes in the purchases. So here's some initial data. Carmen's one of our RAs, so you probably haven't seen this yet, but we just ran this with the first cohort. And 29 of 31 completed the study. So this is really, really high retention. We're really happy about this. And then overall, the numbers for those things we assessed looked really good in terms of people could easily find beverages in the store. They said the UNC Mini Mart felt like a real store. We did this in their closed-ended anonymous survey so they could be honest, but we're going to get some more specific feedback in the exit interviews. Enough beverage options in the store, would recommend the study to a friend. And then we were excited by this, that people said that the drinks that they bought in the store were similar to their regular purchases, which was really the goal for this study. And then to actually look at that piece quantitatively, we're collecting beverage receipts. So people will bring in, they'll actually collect a week's worth of receipts in their 1 week run in, and then their first appointment, we're getting all the information on the beverage purchases and the price and what they were. And then we'll eventually look at the correlation of the receipt purchases with their purchases in the store to see to what extent the behavior is similar. Okay, so just to wrap up, future direction. So that was a pilot. So I think the big thing on the agenda is to use the store for larger scale trials. So we have at least one planned. Starting in January or February, we'll be recruiting 300 parents with half Latino, half not Latino. And we'll be randomizing them to one of the warnings from the first study I showed. So this is just one example. We're agonizing over this decision because we can only pick one. But we have a couple more weeks to decide, and then we'll compare that to a barcode label as a control and see whether the warning changes actual purchases of SSBs. So we'll ask parents to buy a drink for their child, and then we'll see what they actually buy. And then in tandem with this, there's a whole other line of work that is really being led by Christina Chauvenet, a postdoc here in Lindsay. And this is looking at the impact of messages designed to reduce meat consumption to ideally have beneficial effects on both climate and health, because there's a lot of ways we can work together with that highly important topic. So we're still designing these, but we're going to put up posters. This is from the Meatless Monday campaign. So something in this realm where we're looking at, how can we potentially discourage meat purchasing with environmentally themed messages. And so we're still sorting out the protocol for that, but I am really passionate about leveraging data collection opportunities to try to get as much as you can. It's really hard to get people in the door, and that's sort of the main downside to the store, is just getting, of course, recruitment is challenging, and this is a really priority population. So excited about kind of doing this little add-on auxiliary study with the meat focus. And then, of course, lots of other applications. So I'm really interested in tobacco, so I see lots of applications for testing things like e-cigarette warnings or other point of sale policies around tobacco, cannabis, alcohol. There's lots of possibilities, and we only have this one RCT immediately planned. We'll probably be building this into other grant applications, but this is open to other researchers. If people want to use this, please reach out. We did not build the store for just us to use it. We really want it to be a resource here at UNC and for people outside of UNC as well. And then building off of that comment I just made about the challenges to the real store is just statistical power, getting people in the door, in-person data collection, of course. So I'm trying to we're working on this hybrid approach between the MTurk kind of online experiments and the purchasing outcomes by using this virtual store. So this is a store from RTI International, and for this other Robert Wood Johnson study, we partnered with them to use this virtual environment to test policies. So trying to make people at least feel like they're in a real store versus just looking at things on a 2D screen. It's really cool. It's been fun to learn how these work. So this study is not on warning labels, but it's on claims. So it's all product packaging, but this is looking at the impact of things like all natural. There's all kinds of marketing claims that are potentially really misleading because they appear on fruit drinks that are really loaded with added sugar that young kids consume at very high rates, even though they're not healthy. So with this study, we're looking at the extent to which claims actually increases purchasing behavior among parents of younger children for this particular grant. And this one will have a third Latino, a third Black, and a third white. And because we have a pretty large sample size, we'll be able to look at moderation effects there. And then with that same study, we're also building in this other add-on study looking at the impact of warnings on processed foods. So they'll basically do 2 shopping tasks. And so we'll get some data on claims on fruit drinks and then warnings, similar ones to what we're testing in the first study, but applied to a different product, so food instead of beverages. So that is it. I will pause and take time. I think I left a few minutes for questions, but thanks for listening.
I have a question. So for the RCT in the spring, you have the icon running over there. Is there a reason? I know you said that you haven't decided yet for choosing an icon over the graphic.
That's I would love to hear people's. I'll repeat the question. So the question was basically in this slide where I'll have to go back to it. This slide, I highlighted an icon warning. So why, but obviously we haven't picked. So what's the consideration there with an icon versus a graphic warning? And I'm leaning toward the graphic warning, actually, even though I showed this one based on a conversation yesterday. So my thinking evolves every day. But I really think because we have a limited number of people, I want to maximize power. And so even though the differences weren't huge between graphic and icon, the graphic ones were more effective. So I'm leaning actually toward probably a graphic warning for that purpose, but then the graphic warnings themselves performed really similarly. So I'm kind of stumped on which of those. So does anyone have any feedback on that or thoughts? It's tough. I mean, the added sugar one, what we like about that is that's more of the international policy. So we see, and also we're thinking about future funding. So this will be a pilot study in R01. So also just strategically and that's nice because it could work with multiple, funders. And we were really excited that it worked. So it's also more different from what Anna tested in hers with the health warning. So I guess we're tentatively leaning graphic high in added sugar. But we might change our minds again 5 more times. I'm also talking to 2 public health lawyers, so that's the other thing I'm really passionate about is connecting with the right partners who can help you understand the legal context. So I have a couple meetings with them, so I'll take their advice into account too. Yes.
So around the warnings for weight gain and obesity, I have a really hard time conceptualizing how any warning, whether it's text or icon or graphic, can express that without contributing to stigma and weight discrimination and all these like really harmful consequences. So 2 questions. One, have you looped in like people who do activism or policy around this? Like have you collaborated with those like weight positive activists? And then how does that affect how you're making policy recommendations? When you consider like, okay, we do care about health, but there's also real harm that can be done.
It is one of the things we spend the most time talking about. And so in terms of who we're working with, Rebecca, I don't know how to, if it's Pool or Puel at UConn, at the Red Center, she's really, I mean, my understanding is she's like one of the leading researchers on weight stigma. So she's on our advisory board and we reach out to her a lot. And we almost abandoned it as a topic after the stakeholder meeting and after doing reading, but we also felt it was important to get data on it before and also we wanted to try to come up with a warning statement, an image, and just see what happened. But we're concerned about it for that reason. And I don't think that we will probably go with that one for the trial for that, just because I think with an online study, it's just a good opportunity to kind of see how it performs against other things. So yeah, it's a major part of our discussion. I would love to chat with you offline too about any kind of thoughts or people we might want to connect with. But it's really hard to achieve both goals to help kind of reduce sugar drink consumption, but not have and this is the main unintended consequence that we're thinking about and we'll measure in our RCT as well. And Rebecca's helped us a lot with the measurement piece of how do you actually measure potential for weight stigma and discrimination. So I think we're really taking it seriously and trying to measure it so that we can then use that as we think about going forward with recommendations. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Anything else? What else? Other questions? Yes.
I understand that you are trying to do experimental designs, but in terms of evaluating these different interventions, I wonder if there are variations across states, across the states in the US on the type of warning that they use and even text versus graphic.
Yeah, there absolutely could be. You know, from the tobacco angle, we looked at country. So we did a meta-analysis, which I didn't present just for time, but with that, we looked at experiments from all different countries. And interestingly, even country didn't moderate findings, which you'd think if there were differences by state, they would be even more pronounced looking at different countries based on, you know, even some were in countries that had warning labels and some that didn't. The findings were from the experiments were the same, but I think it's an open question and worth looking at, and something that, you know, we talked about at this recent meeting with all the legal people was for, you know, warning labels policy that happens at a state and local level, should there be some kind of regulatory process that includes pre-testing in that particular area, which I think would be smart, but of course the downside is just funding and time, and does that then hold back policies from going forward? But yeah, I don't have I haven't studied that myself, but I think it's definitely worth looking at because yeah, people's reactions and norms can be very different in different contexts. Good point.
I think you mentioned earlier that those with limited English proficiency seem to be more deterred by some of the warning labels than those with less. And it sounded like you weren't quite sure what might be happening there.
Yeah.
I am completely unfamiliar with this literature, but one thing that I thought of is perhaps the risk for not reading it carefully is higher if you come across something in a foreign language. There's more incentive to make sure you read it in case it's something
That's
really
true.
dire, like this will kill you tomorrow or something like that. So I was trying to think if I found something in a different language, I would be like, hey, someone's got to read this for me because I don't know what it says. So perhaps the incentive to read it carefully and to think it over and even to have someone like read it for you and then add social pressure, just there might be something going on there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's a very legitimate possible explanation. I think I might have the same reaction. And And I think I've thought about, in the future, I want to do eye tracking and learn how to use that method and propose that in my K. So hopefully we'll make that happen. But basically my hypothesis there was the same for attention, that it would be higher among those with limited English proficiency. So they're probably spending longer time trying to look at it, interpret it, translate it to the extent possible. So I like that. Thank you. I'll probably put it on paper. A few other options.
I guess our host is not here, so.
I will have a host, yes.
Oh, yeah.
And if there's not any more questions, thank you, Marissa.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, he did. I just forgot this.